Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Leftover Makeover. Today we're showing you how to turn these stale pieces of bread, some leftover tomato sauce, and a half-eaten cereal bar, and a couple of other basic ingredients into a delicious rustic bread loaf. We're starting this recipe by preparing our ingredients and cutting this bitten off cereal bar into pieces, chugging it right into the mixer, into the food blender, and then crumbling up our leftover bread, our stale bread, crumbling it up into smaller pieces so that our mixer can deal with it. There are of course various other applications for dried bread. You can either turn it into breadcrumbs right away and use them for further recipes, or you can cut it into small cubes and fry it up with some olive oil and or garlic to get some lovely croutons for as toppings for salad or soups. Get everything in there. Right. That's it. And now we head over to the grinder and grind it to a fine powder-like consistency. Now, as with every bread, yeast, dough, or whatever, we start by adding our water. In our case, that's about 200 milliliters of water, lukewarm, to a cup, and adding about 5 to 10 grams of yeast, dry active yeast, and a teaspoon of sugar. So that to make sure that the yeast is actually alive and flourishing, and we're giving it some sugar to taste. Now that's set, and that has to rest for 10 minutes, and when it foams, we will show it to you again, and then you can see if the yeast is alive or not. Into our bowl go our dry ingredients. That's our breadcrumbs. I would estimate it's like 100 grams or so, together with 3 tablespoons of rye flour, just for seasoning or taste. Then we're adding about a teaspoon of baking powder, a teaspoon of sugar, and a teaspoon of salt. Mix for a bit until everything is nice and homogeneous. We're adding about 300 grams of flour. Remember, you can always add more flour, but it's difficult to retrieve flour from your dough. So always start a bit low on the flour, and then after you added your liquid ingredients, you can see if the consistency works out for you and add flour as needed. If you add water, of course, or liquid ingredients, your dough gets more and more, and yeah, you'll end up with way too much dough, and you will need to check in for another video to see what to do with your leftover dough. Oops. Okay, now that's set. We can take a look at our dry active yeast. It's bubbling and foaming and showing signs of life, so we can use that and dump it into our bread mixture. And now that's where the fun starts. We showed you in our starting screen some breadcrumbs and seeds left over from our bread cutting board. We're tossing them in there too, but you can get creative at this point. You can use whatever seeds you like, whatever other ingredients you have, dried fruit even. And we of course will be adding our leftover tomato sauce, which is, you know, always this amount that everybody is too afraid to eat because it's too little for an actual another portion of food and too much to just throw away. So we are just going to throw that in there and get a nice tomato Mediterranean style bread out of it. Boom, there we go. Now we're throwing it under in the stand mixer with our dough hook attachment. Start slow. So now if we take a look at our dough, we see it's quite moist, right? It's quite a mess in there, and I'm noticing, alright, I had too much liquid, I need to add some more flour. That's no big deal because we accounted for that, right? And you want to add just enough flour so after a couple of minutes of kneading the dough comes together by itself and forms a bowl in the mixer. Now that's just right. You see how the dough pulls away from the walls of the mixer? Then you know it's ready to knead by hand for a couple of minutes. Okay, now lightly flour your work surface. We're just using the same old board we used to cut our bread on, and there's some breadcrumbs left. That's no big deal. It will all get incorporated into our dough. Now, turn it out onto your work surface. Get everything out of the bowl. And knead away. So when kneading any kind of dough, really, you're doing a stretch and pull motion. See how I'm folding the dough onto itself? Folding, 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 press, press, fold. Stretch and fold. So to enable the gluten development. Fold and stretch. Fold and stretch. Fold and stretch. After a couple of minutes of kneading, you will realize how the dough becomes way less sticky, pulls together, holds together, and gets smoother and smoother. That's where we're heading. I'm making sure to collect all bits and nooks and crannies lying around on the table and stuck on the board, so to use all of my resources effectively. If the dough seems too sticky or it's too hard for you to work with, just grab a little more flour on your hands and on the board, or just be patient and knead and fold and stretch and fold. Now we have this smooth, coherent ball of dough that is sticky but not too sticky. It doesn't like cling to my hand or anything like that. And it springs back, but only just springs back to the touch. Then we're getting our bowl and lightly oiling it from all sides and placing our dough into the bowl and covering it with a kitchen towel or a plastic wrap and letting it rest for at least 1 hour or until doubled in size. Any of those dough remains left in the bowl will naturally adhere to our dough while proving. Right. Just dump it in there and make sure it has enough room so it can double in size. This dough will rise to about here. So I need to make sure to cover it with something non-stick. So kitchen towel wouldn't be not the best idea. I'm using this reusable foil. It's a little tight, but it'll do. Like so. And now we're letting it rest in a warm spot without a draft for an hour at least. It is now the next day, and as we see, the dough has risen nicely and more than doubled in size. Now it's really airy, fluffy and bubbly, and should have gained some nice aromatics too overnight. So now what you want to do is generously flour our work surface. And get our dough out of there. Oh, that's so satisfying. Oh, nice. Now roll up your sleeves. Flour the top a bit too. And get to kneading. Same technique as yesterday, or as before. Fold and press. Fold and press. As you see, the dough seems quite a bit more moist than before, since all the flour has hydrated and is now almost ready for the oven. Giving it like a couple of minutes of kneading until all the air has puffed out, and then we're going to put it into its final form and let it proof for another hour and a half or so, or at least for 30 minutes. A lot of aspiring bread bakers skip the second proofing process because they think they want their bread now or they're impatient. But you shouldn't, because your bread will be very dense and tightly packed without the nice crumb and air you want in there. So be patient, let it proof for a second time, and then put it into the oven. Now we have to decide what is the final form for our bread. Do we want to make a loaf? Do we want to make bread rolls? Do we want to make a round loaf, I guess, without baking form? So we made the decision to form a round loaf today. This is like a bit more difficult than a regular loaf within a pan. You need to add a little bit more flour to the dough for it to be more coherent in shape, and so we're needing a bit more flour in there. If you want the simplest way possible, just grease a bread tin, line it with baking paper, and put your dough in there to proof for the second time, and you're done. And then you can put it into the oven and done. But with the freestanding, so to speak, bread loaf, it's a bit more difficult. So we're incorporating about 2 to 3 tablespoons worth of flour into the bread till we have a nice cohesive, tacky but not sticky dough. Right. Now, what you want to do, what is absolutely crucial for a free-standing loaf to hold together, is you kind of want to form a bubble of gluten on top of the bread. How do you do it? You grab your bread and stuff the edges into itself. A little bit sticky. Need just a little bit more flour. Too sticky. And so we add flour as necessary. Don't be afraid to adjust your recipes so that it feels right. If you think you need more liquid, add more liquid. If you think you need more flour, don't be afraid to add more. Your loaf might come out a bit more dry than you expected, but that's just experience. Right. Now, we pull the edges and tuck them underneath of our bread ball. And then we kind of turn it and keep tucking the edges of the dough underneath itself. And you already can see that the dough, when I'm putting it just on the working surface, it does not flatten out as before. Before it just would like spread out, and now it's already holding together its shape a little bit better. And there we go. I think this should work just nicely. Now we just lined a baking tray with parchment paper, and you can just plop your loaf on there. Now cover it with a towel or plastic foil or whatever you have. Let it rest for at least 20 minutes. Alright, our loaf has puffed up a bit. Now we have to be gentle to not let all the precious air out again. And into the oven it goes. Alright, and through the magic of editing, we are now in front of our nice freshly baked bread. But I have to warn you, let it cool completely before cutting into it, because it will dry out otherwise. So, but now enough talking, let's do the fork test. Hear that? Nice crunchy. Nice hollow sound. Nice hollow sound to it. So yeah, let's see how we did. Now that's what we're looking for. Nice crust, not too dense, not too airy inside, but a very good crumb with this nice orange, with this lovely orange color to it from the tomato sauce. And yeah, worked out well.